As always, we'll be making this available on the DevLake YouTube and sharing it on Slack for all of our asynchronous community members, which I believe these days is the vast majority of you. So for those listening to the recording, thank you as always. So let's quickly pull this up, and then we'll roll right into this.
Great.
All right. 3, 2, 1. All right. It is April 27th. It's a lovely sunny day here in California. Always a sunny day in the global wonderland that is the DevLake community. Thank you for all of you tuning in here in real time. We always appreciate you taking the time to join us live. And for those watching the recording, thank you, of course, for diving into the lake with us on your own schedule. And I'm grateful for all of you being part of this incredible community. This week, I'm very excited to be having a great conversation with a longtime friend, collaborator, and fantastic leader in the open source ecosystem, and certainly, in my view and the view of many others, a real thought leader when it comes to metrics and data and its role in open source in particular. Um, Very grateful to have Avi Press today. I'll pass the mic to Avi to provide an introduction to himself. He's got a great story. He's been building something great. Avi, thanks so much for joining. Would love to hear about what are you up to today, and how did you get there?
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Um, yeah, so my name's Avi Press. I'm the founder and CEO at a company called Scarf, which provides download and adoption metrics, as well as user and customer intelligence for open source software projects. My background is as a software engineer, and I got onto this track just by building a lot of tools myself, just whether it was at work for fun or at work or for fun or, what have you. But finding some amount of success in those open source projects and really, really struggling to understand how those projects are actually being used. At the time where I was really in the thick of a lot of this stuff, it was really around the question of, should I quit my job to go build a business around some of these tools? And that being a very hard question to answer in a way that I felt good about making that huge decision. Um, and this really took me down a path of talking to tons and tons of open source developers about, both from an open source sustainability angle, just as well as generally, like, how do we measure anything that we are doing here, and what kind of success and what kind of impact it's really having. So that has kind of taken me down this path of to where I am now of building Scarf, and we're really, really laser focused on the side of metrics in open source when it comes to usage. How's the stuff actually getting used? How do the things that you are working on actually impact your users, your customers, your community, et cetera?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense as something to pursue because speaking from firsthand experience as we grow DevLake, right? Probably many of you listening to this recording have had me DM you at some point or another, looking to chat with you, looking to learn more about your use case and your experience. And one of the most valuable things for us as leaders of an open source product is being able to get insights from real users to understand like what's going well, where are you getting stuck, what's frustrating, what's breaking, how can we make this better. It's such a challenge, of course, to be able to get these insights and understand like what exactly is going on. We know it's growing like wild. We know there's thousands and thousands of downloads. But to Avi's point and the ultimate objective of Scarf, like how do you figure out who those people are? How do you figure out how they're using this stuff? It's a very big challenge and one that is fundamentally critical to not just commercialization, right? Throw all that to the side. Like even just being able to improve the project, to be able to have those discussions and understand what's happening, just to improve something is really key. So I'm such a big believer in what you guys are building and making happen at Scarf, and we're proud to be partnering with you guys. So
Likewise, yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
Um,
lots to come from that.
Absolutely.
So I'd love to dive in, Avi. You of course have quite a bit of experience with metrics in engineering, I think in general, and certainly with open source. If you're up for it, I'd love to kind of cleave that question into two. Maybe start with your bread and butter, which is the open source piece, and then maybe dive into any kind of day-to-day stuff with what you've worked on. Um, what metrics kind of come to mind for you? What approaches, like what frameworks, like how do you think about metrics in that role of assessing either the health or robustness of an open source ecosystem? And then how do you apply that same kind of metrics-driven approach to maybe assessing your own internal processes or quality or delivery? Would love to dive into that.
Yeah. Um, so I think when it comes to metrics, we there's a big emphasis on taking a step back before you even dive into them and say like, well, why are you doing this in the first place? I think is a really important thing because, and maybe this is something that you hear all the time as you talk about this, but like getting very clear on what your actual goals are and not falling into a trap of measuring things that feel obvious because they seem just generally good. Separately of like what really you actually are trying to do. And so like, one example of that kind of thing is like, oh, we want to measure dev velocity or these kinds of things. It's like a fairly intuitive thing that you want to do. But well, why does dev velocity matter, right? Like, well, we want to ship features, but if there could be a world where you really only need to ship like one thing to really hit the goals that you actually care about, which might be growth, it might be revenue, it might be customers, whatever that looks like. And to not, to not fall in a pit of just saying, oh, well, we're pushing features, that's great, because it might not really be that important to do. And so for us at Scarf, what we really, what we're really focused on is trying to make sure that the things that you are doing are actually leading to more people using it, less people churning, more companies showing up. Where maybe there's regional expansion that you're working on. And seeing how your day-to-day efforts are actually impacting those things further down the road. That's not to say that measuring things that the more day-to-day development, how much time we're spending working on bugs versus features, like these kinds of really classical metrics that most engineering teams are looking at in some form or another, but to contextualize those metrics in terms of what your actual KPIs are. Did we spend more time working on docs is great, but did it actually impact the conversion rate of our docs to how people actually go to download our thing? That's what we ultimately care about. If we can achieve that without spending more time working on docs, great, let's grab a beer and go home. Like that's ultimately I think what we really want to care about. And so I think from Scarf's perspective, we try to really like have as minimal amount of KPIs that we are staring at each week. And then when there's an anomaly, time to dig in. Oh, something dipped in our KPI, what happened? And then we're measuring tons of different things that we can look at to assess contributing factors, but we're not necessarily like staring at bug to feature velocity every day or every week, because that's ultimately not the thing that we want to optimize just for its own sake. Maybe that was a full answer to the question, but maybe there's more to that we can dive into. So that's kind
Yeah.
of my initial thoughts to that question, but there's like a whole lot more that I would probably say.
No, I think those are really great thoughts, and it brings something to mind for me too with our experience with DevLake, and it's a conversation I love having with many of our enterprise users, some of whom run into challenges getting like buy-in from the top, right? Figuring out like, okay, we want to operate with more precision. We want to find ways to really kind of capture, articulate, and celebrate our successes, figure out why they're successes and socialize them, figure out where there are bottlenecks and solve them in a targeted way. Then they get to some, maybe a dogmatic CTO or VP of engineering who's like, all we want is better customer reviews, more money, more stable software. And it's like, okay, well, those are great objectives, and we can back into those with these more root cause perspectives with metrics. And I do love that in many ways, right? Especially what Scarf is building, is in many ways, right? Like for all of you listening using DevLake, if you've got an open source project or technology, Scarf is a natural extension to DevLake, where DevLake is going to help you answer those questions of like, how are we delivering? What's kind of the underlying reason for process and software failing or succeeding or over or underachieving our goals? And then when you want to keep going further and figure out like, okay, now how is that translating into user action? Like the
Exactly.
things that we ultimately care about at the end of this pipe. Um, those are such critical things. So I like that, you're taking that perspective, and it's one that's always shared, right? Is how do we get more growth? How do we get more retention? How do we make something that people care about? And how can we prove that that's working? Or when it isn't, how can we get some
Yeah.
insights?
And I think that's the tricky part about it because it's like there's not really a silver bullet answer to this question in a way of like, okay, well, how do we connect, very granular engineering metrics to the outcomes that our business cares about? And it's like, well, I don't know.
Yeah,
Like it's not, very contextual, very not obvious. But if you're not measuring it, you're going to have a really like what do you like you have to be measuring it in order to even kind of see these relationships over time. But there's no sense in being a well-tuned engineering machine working on all the wrong things. So it's
yeah.
like, you got to really, you got to be very careful about that.
It's a really great point. I like that quote. Like, there's no point in being a well-tuned engineering machine if you're working on the wrong things. And to that end, right, that's where the role of like for any of you using DevLake in your practices, right? It's something we evangelize all the time, which is never forget the human part of the story. Like make sure you're having the right conversations to figure out from the managers, from the developers, from your customers, like what are the goals? What do you want to fix? What do you want to improve? What do you want to make sure stays reliable because it's working? And then you can start backing into that and use those metrics to support intelligent decision making and to support good conversations and targeted actions. But they themselves aren't going to solve the challenge.
Yeah.
I do like to think about metrics as like using like a cardiologist analogy, right? Like you're never going to get a patient healthy and diagnosed by just looking at heart rate or just looking at weight or just looking at height or any of these signals, right? It's this
Right.
constellation of signals that helps you make a great decision, great diagnosis, and take action.
Yeah, and the one thing I'd add to that too is like those metrics. As soon as something is going differently, like something kind of goes suddenly wrong, that's when those metrics like need to be there because that's when you need to start diagnosing stuff, and that's where the metrics are like that's what they're there for. And if you're wanting to say like, okay, we've seen this problem, maybe we've seen the cause, and it's this metric, this kind of more granular metric here. Now, what do we do about that? Now you have something very concrete that you can fix. But yeah, I mean, you need to have that measurement there in the first place, and you also need to be keeping your eye on the one thing that you're actually trying to optimize for in the first place because you can't you're not going to find all the anomalies if you're tracking like 100 things, which you probably should be. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And there's a good grain of wisdom hidden in that statement too, which is to not focus on too many things at once and to figure out what's going to matter and triage it, right? So that you can make sure you're figuring out if things are changing for the better or worse based off of your inputs. And so that it's easier to ultimately react to that and optimize for it. If you're trying to optimize for 20 different dimensions, naturally, it's going to be a challenge, if not impossible, to figure out are things working? Are they going as expected or not? So some really good thoughts in there. And I'm curious, Avi, I imagine perhaps more than almost anybody, you're chatting with open source leaders and maintainers. Um, they're probably diving into Scarf, looking at the metrics. I'm curious if there are any kind of metrics that you've seen maintainers in particular kind of respond really positively to, where it's a aha moment for them, where like all of a sudden some mystery is revealed or some question is answered. I'd love to better understand from the perspective of the maintainers, like what excites them, and of course for our audience here, there's no mystery or controversy to the fact that the overwhelming majority of all software is built on a foundation of open source. So no matter what conversation we're having, whether you're in enterprise video gaming, whether you're in banking, somehow or another, this conversation has deep, deep relevance. And I'm sure many of you know that. So would love to hear that, Avi. What do you see usually?
Yeah, I mean, far and away the most like, oh my God, kind of thing that we surface to people is just the organizations that we see in the data using the software. So if you're, say you have a Docker container and that gets 10,000 downloads, like where did that come from? And we're showing you these organizations. And when I see maintainers see their dashboard of like, oh, NASA's using this, or insert some like really cool and impressive organization that they didn't know about. Like that's, I think, the most like rewarding thing to see. Is ultimately just like, oh, my work has impact and it matters. And I think from especially like the pure open source side, especially for whether it's like an indie developer or a nonprofit or these kinds of things, like just kind of seeing that impact is really kind of what the thing I think that people are just really, really rewarded by. I think that, I mean, yeah, ultimately that's just what people want to see, is that their work is actually having an impact.
Yeah.
I think in the more in the more um, like quantitative sense, in terms of just like whether it's businesses or more broad audiences, um, seeing things like engagement through open source metrics, I think is one thing that people really like to see. So not just did big bank download the thing, but do they, when you cut a new release, how long does it take until you see them pick it up? um, these kinds of ways to track engagement, um, I think are pretty enlightening for folks, because one thing that people learn is that, my user base is a lot broader than the people who are in our Slack community. It's really great to have people kind of talking to you, engaging with you like face to face, or over chat or these kinds of things. But I think people are kind of consistently surprised by that just being kind of the tip of the iceberg a bit. And ultimately, the goal is to get more of those people to actually engage more directly with you. It's hard to do that until you kind of are doing any kind of measurement to know that that activity is going on. Um, so I think there's often surprises in the data there, of just like, oh, the reach is a lot bigger than I realized. And also I'd say, oh, the numbers that I was looking at up until now were a lot noisier than I thought. Sometimes you'll see a spike in downloads and it turns out it was just from one CI system just polling over and over. And you see this big spike and really it's totally meaningless. Other times your downloads could go down, but really important people showed up that week for the first time, and your overall trend wouldn't have showed that. And so, like, to not get too fixated on things like download counts and these kinds of things, but really what's in them. Yeah.
Totally.
So that's been kind of the key stuff, I would say, from Scarf's perspective.
And something that is kind of cooked into everything you just said that I really love is this idea that metrics for the creators themselves, right? The engineers building the product, maintaining the product. Um, the metrics can be this moment of celebration and moment of kind of recharge. And I think that's so
Mm-hmm.
important, because I think if there's anything that I wish I could wave a magic wand for when it comes to dev data in general, it's that I think a lot of people have had such negative experiences where metrics have purely been used to take a detached and often incorrect way of grading and assessing people. And it's just this purely negative thing. And what I get so excited about with DevLake is the conversations we have where we've helped teams realize, like, hey, we're doing way better than even
Yeah.
we realized. And I think it's a trait that's somewhat unique to certainly consistent to engineers in general, is like we're all a self-critical, like self-analytical bunch. Chances are, like, your assessment of yourself is likely more negative than reality is the case. And you dive into these metrics and you might just find a moment of joy, right? A moment of, to really kind of celebrate the work that you've been doing and articulate that and share that with others. And I do think as trite as that might sound, there's so much power just in that, because it's about people at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think celebrating milestones is very underrated by most teams. And probably, I mean, I could be better about this at Scarf too. We can celebrate more wins, and we're always trying to do that. But yeah, it's a really great, it's a really good practice to be looking at these kinds of metrics all the time, because then it really will start to stand out, and it forces you to keep in mind like why you're working on this stuff in the first place and what your goals actually are. Um, yeah, and I think this is one of those things like for for all of us in the open source space, if you rely on stuff, you should just tell the maintainers from time to time. It'll make their day. Like
Absolutely.
just a little more positivity out in the open source space would be good for everybody.
Yeah. No, and I can't reinforce that point enough. And I want to thank every one of our users who's jumped on a Zoom call with us or given us some good feedback. It is so, so valuable.
Yeah.
And even just a thank you or words of encouragement, I know mean the world to every single person who's touching that code base. It really does make a difference. So it's so
Yeah.
true. I'm curious, Avi, to dive into a maybe a peripheral question to this discussion. It's certainly something I've seen many kind of enterprise CIOs and CTOs talk about and ask questions for. They're maybe assessing, okay, we know this big open source piece is going to be a critical part of our puzzle. It's part of our architecture, it's part of our strategy. Um, Maybe there's two or three open source projects that are serving the same value proposition and we're looking at all three. Or maybe there's a project that got forked and now there's kind of two rival
Hmm.
projects, if you will. I want to make sure I pick the best one. When someone asks that kind of question, or you were presented with that kind of question, like what comes to mind when you're assessing like best one? Like what goes into the strength or health or kind of robustness of an open source community? What are the signals that you would be looking for to determine like yes, this is really off to the races and looking good, or hey, this might be a little more precarious than might your eyes might suggest on initial glance.
Oh yeah, that's such a good question. I think, let me think. One, I mean, at a really high level, I think beyond just like stars, forks, and contributor size, these kinds of things, I really also want to look at the rate of change of those things over time. Like, is this slowing down or speeding up or holding fairly constant is a really important one. Like for whatever metric you pick, you want to look at kind of the value and then also the rate of change of those things. Um, I think that yeah, obviously like yeah, community size and what other companies I think are using it is a really, really good one of like if it's all really large companies and I'm at a startup, like should maybe think about that. Is this really the the solution that's kind of more geared towards our use case or yeah, like finally optimized for our use case, or is it more kind of set it and forget it kind of thing? Um, One other thing which I think I've been caring about more and more over time, in a commercial setting for sure, is just who on our team knows the technology a bit. Actually, has kind of become more important than I maybe would have expected before running a company. It's just like that. That expertise that you have in house is like actually really important, because if people have to learn a new tool, there's just the cost associated with that switch, and if people know the one, and if the people know one but not the other alternative, like really weights things quite a bit, I would say. Um, and then, I mean, I think some of these metrics might depend a little bit on the kind of project that we're talking about. Like, is this a library? Is this an application? Or these kinds of things? And the metrics might matter a little bit more, kind of depending on the case. But I think for some things, like having multiple companies that are kind of like, if it's in like a more neutral place where a lot of companies are contributing to it, that's really helpful. Other times it really doesn't matter at all, and if anything might be worse if I want to make sure that something is going to be moving really quickly and there's like a lot of features that we're going to need. Um, so I have no concise answer to this question, I guess, is really the long and short of it. But there's just like a whole bunch of factors that I'm looking at, from like kind of the pace of the project, whether or not my team is already familiar with it or not. Um, if multiple companies are contributing to it or not, and who's using it.
Yeah. No, I mean, those are great fundamentals, of course, and something we think about a lot for ourselves. And we have loved with some of our open source maintainers, like figuring out some things to focus on with this. And I think to Avi's point, right, which is it's kind of the heartbeat of releases and how the community is functioning. It's very valuable to look at things like how quickly are issues being responded to, how
Yeah,
quickly
big
are
one.
issues being closed, like are PRs actually flowing or are there log jams, and all of these things like back into exactly Avi's point, which is like, is there consistency? Is there a tempo to releases, to community chatter, to users, and is it being supported by kind of this diverse constellation of different types of contributors and companies, or is it very isolated? And all of these things can give you kind of an index of like almost like decentralization, right? Of like, is this thing going to be around no matter what, or is it ultimately dependent on that one proverbial guy in the basement of in Kansas,
Yeah, yeah,
hacking away all day long? And if he gets the flu, everything goes to hell. Right? So,
yeah. It's scary. But that can be okay too.
yeah.
It really depends.
Exactly. And I think that's a great reminder too of just like extreme practicality, which is when you're looking to get an open source technology running in your own stack, you got to make sure you've got the in-house competencies to be able to actually do it. Of course, communities can help you plenty. We always do our best with DevLake, but at the same time, there's only so much we can do, right? We can help you debug a deep issue and implementation, but we can't go through the installation for you.
Right. Your elbow grease is going to be required one way or another on the open source thing, and kind of understanding what your bandwidth is for said elbow grease is something to get very clear on, unless you want to just pay for someone to do that for you, which is also typically very encouraged too by whoever's supporting that project. So either way, I think it's pick your own adventure, but I think just to be clear on like what your like expected cost of ownership is going to be, which is super hard to know ahead of time, but to try to guess.
Absolutely. A more kind of general question, and I'll let you kind of take this in whichever direction makes sense for you.
Sure.
I know a common challenge. When we talk about metrics, we talk about data. I think one challenge that we see universally is like, okay, now I have the insight, now I have the data. Like, now what? Like, how do I take this and turn it into action? And I'm curious if you were giving advice to, say, like a engineering manager or CTO um, who's in that predicament. What advice would you give to like turn a metric or a group of metrics like into a game plan? How do you turn those things into action?
Yeah, I think this is a question I think we're dealing with Scarf like a lot as well, because people are asking us this exact question. I see all this data in Scarf, but like, what do I do with this? And so we're obviously, or not obviously, we are building things in our product to try to help with this kind of thing, but it's really not very trivial. And so I think one way that I like to think about this, and I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, was what would you do if this metric just was like what was cut by 50% like next week? What would you do? um which kind of forces you to think through your model of how all these pieces fit together. And once you get clear on that, um you can kind of develop an intuition on what on just really the cause and effects in your system, and what you need to really optimize in order to get at kind of what that goal is. um, and so I think this notion of understanding how all the metrics in your stack fit together in some way is kind of the what do I do now, is to kind of develop your understanding of build your model of how these things fit together for your particular organization. And then make sure that you're looking at these KPIs every week, ideally, if not every day, or whatever cadence makes sense for your project. But to kind of do that analysis up front of, if this goes up a lot, how would we think about the investigation of what metrics cause that? If this dropped off, what's the disaster recovery plan? If you get really clear on that plan, you'll be ready for when it inevitably does happen, which it will over, just a matter of time. As well as just centering a lot of your processes around this data. So you're building like a data-driven organization. Again, I feel like I'm giving you a lot of like really not super direct answers to the question, but that's kind of the framework that we are thinking about this stuff in. Because over time, like I think the anomaly detection and explanation, I think is kind of one of the really key things here, is that a lot of these numbers don't really tell you all that much in a vacuum. They have to be contextualized with each other and in the whole group over time.
Yeah.
We patched, we had 10 PRs merged this week. Is that good or bad? Like, that's not inherently a good or bad number. You can only know if that's good or bad in context.
Absolutely. No, and I actually would say this is a perfect answer in many ways. Even for me, I've like someone who's thinking about this nearly every single day. You've given me kind of an aha moment here for how to translate these things into something really practical. And I think it speaks to the importance of having conversations that these kind of metrics and approaches empower and drive forward. And I think it's a really, really fantastic framework to use in those conversations to maybe go kind of metric by metric. Let's say you've got your Dora dashboard set up and a few other kind of key metrics that you're focused on, and just have that discussion as a team in theoretical to say, if this kind of doubled or halved overnight or on a week, what would that mean for us? Like, what would we look into? How would we respond? If we were asked to double this or we were asked to half it, like what actions would we take? And it's those conversations that will always be unique to the team, unique to the project, unique to the company. Those conversations are going to equip you with this playbook that you can run as a manager or as even a frontline contributor to be able to think through these things and say, okay, here are our goals, here are benchmarks, objectives, whatever it is. Here's how we can actually turn this into something that is actionable and we can just dive into today. I love that framework, Avi. It's something I'm even gonna think about writing.
Great.
We should chat about that because
we should.
it's a very like elegant and simple way to just think through like how do you make these things actually actionable? Because it's always the blocker, I think, for teams that are they want to be data driven, they become data driven, they get the metrics in place, they collect the data, and then they get to that now what question. And I love that this addresses such a big part of that now what question.
Yeah, I think, and the other thing that this is actually kind of just coming to mind as I'm talking about this, is that a lot of times it ends up feeling a lot like debugging a system, like just like any kind of program that you are writing, of like, oh, like this output is not what we want. Like, what inputs can we tweak, and what actually matters? And you can be quite scientific with it if you have all of those numbers in front of you. And so that's a really, really powerful position to be in if you're running a team, to be able to have such observability into your own team.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I love that you say that too, because that's one way that we love to talk about DevLake, because it's got so many use cases. But of course, one fundamental one is like it functions as a debugging tool for company and process level things. Like, how do you figure out what's going right and what's going wrong, and drill into like the solves, or if it's going really well, like how do you figure out like what is going really well so that you can share that and spread it, because that's where improvement happens. And I think everyone loves that culture of self-improvement where we're figuring out like, okay, how do we keep getting easier, better, faster, cheaper, right? It's like the goal of every business, no matter what. So
yeah,
this is a great discussion. I'm so glad we landed on this. I would love to dive in, Avi, to maybe part of your kind of personal journey. I think you're somewhat unique in the sense that you're a founder and a CEO, but you're obviously a highly technical CEO. I think many people like yourself, we see maybe they are the CTO of their company and they have a CEO who is the kind of non-technical yin to their yang. I'd love to hear from your kind of journey, what's it been like being a technical CEO, and what are some of the kind of challenges that have perhaps surprised you? And what advice would you maybe give to any of our kind of technical audience who maybe have aspirations of their own to become a startup, founder, and maybe they're excited to say, you know what, like I want to step into that CEO, seat, and I can be a great collaborator to my CTO, but I'm going to find a CTO. Would love to hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been a huge adjustment on like every level imaginable. I think from like the my own life and relationship with work has really shifted over time, but on the more technical fronts, I think a lot of my philosophies that I came in with as an engineer have really morphed over time in kind of the business perspective. And I think one of the biggest ways is just the way that I think about like pragmatism, I guess, when it comes to developing product has really shifted. I like by trade, I would do a lot of functional programming in Haskell, and I would love to think about like, oh, I want to express my problems in a really formal mathematical way that's like rigorously formally verifiable, all of these things, which I still love. That I mean, it like academically very really interests me, but like on a day-to-day management perspective is not something that I care about a whole lot anymore when it comes to Scarf. I'm much more oriented with, how can we ship this thing 3 days sooner or something, rather than, how can we make sure that the code is very elegant. Um, and I think, that's a very extreme example of like, full like 180 shifts in thinking when it comes to engineering. But I think that concept is very, is pretty pervasive. Like I just care a lot more about speed of shipping than I did before, and talking to users and getting feedback on stuff than I cared about before. And so yeah, it's been I think just a real adjustment into kind of a new way of thinking about like what is practical, and trade-offs of things, like it just the trade-offs that we're making every day, I think are much more on my mind. um, and so like when I see the team like bike shedding about some technical decision, which from an engineering perspective might be very important, now I'm like, from the business value, do we actually care about what we pick here? Does it really matter? And I think a lot of the times, especially in the startup context, really might not matter. Should we pick this open source project or that one? Maybe the best one is the one that you get done the quickest, because you can go change it later. But there's no, the compounding nature of value if you're shipping stuff quickly. Like that's really what's going to drive your success at the end of the day. And if your organization or company is not successful, then you're not building anything. And so, what's even the point of bike shedding it too much if your business is going to go under? So I think it's like put a lot of this. It's kind of introduced a whole new level of urgency to all the things that we're building and doing, which really makes you distill down what you actually care about, and do away with all the other things that you don't.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So there's
Something
so many aspects I could talk about that for hours, surely, but
for
I'll leave it
sure.
there.
And something you touched upon, which I think is such a key takeaway, and I think it's probably one of the key values of being an engineer, a technical person in the CEO seat, is you touched upon this critical, small but important detail of trade-offs, right? Which is you're able to understand that if our key objective here is driving a faster release cycle and pushing more features more often, that's going to naturally have its costs. And I think perhaps that's one of the values of bringing these metrics into the discussion, to work with a CEO or an executive that doesn't have that perspective, to be able to really understand and articulate what that means, right? Where great, we want to ship faster, we can do that, but here's what it might mean. Like you can expect we might have higher change failure rates because we're gonna naturally be writing, or reviewing faster in a way that's going to result in just naturally more buggy stuff, and that's an unavoidable reality of this prioritization.
Yeah, and that might be okay. And you just got to, yeah, just to be kind of aware of those trade-offs. And I think for, for kind of those non-technical, for the CTOs that have that non-technical CEO, like the name of the game is just making sure that, I mean, I guess two things. One, that they understand the relationships of these these, engineering metrics to the ones that they are staring at and they care about. Because like we said, it's not obvious a lot of the time what those relationships are, and you may need to learn them over time. And then, to manage their expectations, I think, being the other thing. I think like the main job of the CTO is to manage the expectations of everyone around them. And so the best way to do that is with a just really quantitative analysis on what's going to happen, I think, is really or for most people, I would think.
Absolutely. No, and it's something that I think is one of the, certainly in my experience, has been one of the big misconceptions of the CTO role too, is that it's deep in the code, right? It's highly technical all of
Yeah.
the time, and of course, yes, but it's also this part that you're touching upon, which is that kind of expectations management and alignment, and being able to cross pollinate that information and those expectations and those goals across all of the teams. Because at the end of the day, like a company is a collection of those units rather than these things operating in isolation. And I think that's so key.
It's a tough job. It's a tough job to be a good CTO.
Exactly. No, it's one, I'm grateful that we like shout out to Hajong, our CTO, who does it so well. Where it's such a challenge. Where I'm very fortunate that I get to focus on a relatively narrow set of things that even then feel overwhelming, and having even broader scope, right, to deal with everything. Really, such a overwhelming thought. So I would love to kind of run into our kind of final question here, Avi, keeping mindful of our time. And this has
Hmm.
been such a great discussion, so many great takeaways. I would love to get your thoughts. Like someone sits down with you at a coffee shop, and they give you this very weird question, right? That no one would really ask out loud. They're like, Avi, I want to become a data-driven leader. What advice would you give them? Like whether it's deep in the weeds of like, okay, let's focus on these things, or maybe really high level philosophical. When confronted with that question, what things come to mind for you of like, how do you become a intelligently data driven leader?
I think, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one thing that I would say is like you can't really be optimizing what you're not measuring. So that's kind of the first like baseline. I think the table stakes here is you just got to be measuring this stuff, and there's really just no way around it. Um, and to make sure that you are measuring kind of all the things that you might conceivably ever need to use. And so that's like step zero, of that advice. Um, then I would say to just be very, very thoughtful about why you care. Why do you even want to bother being data driven? Why, what outcomes do you actually want? Are you trying to grow this thing really big? Are you trying to have very meaningful impact for a small number of people? Like, what do you actually care to do? Um, and I think that like a lot of the steps become very obvious once you get clear on that why question of like why do we want to bother even being data driven, and like what outcomes are we hoping to achieve with it, rather than just kind of rushing in and saying like, oh well, here's the obvious things that we want to see and optimize for, to just take a step back first. However, the sooner you start measuring stuff, the more trends over time you can see. And so I think like I would advise a lot of urgency on that. Like, drop everything that you're doing and make sure that you're measuring this stuff first. Then once you've got the instrumentation, now take a step back and really think about this and be very thoughtful. I think when it comes to any kind of like leadership of teams, I advocate for giving yourself the space to really think through it, rather than kind of rushing into something, and just guns ablazing. Where here's what we're optimizing.
Yeah. I really love like the core of what you're saying makes all the sense in the world, and I think it's a great reminder for our listeners, which is like have that thoughtful discussion, meditate on yourself as a leader, figure out like what is the ultimate objective that we're going for? Like what is success going to really look like here? Are we if we care about our customers, right? We want to release more features, we want to release more we're getting complaints about stability or usability. Like, what does that mean, and how can we reverse engineer all the way through the delivery chain, like all the way to where the issues are created and tickets are written in Jira, right? Figure out like what if that's the output, what are the inputs, and how can we really take a look at those? And then how can we use these frameworks that we've kind of almost discovered and discussed today of like start game planning through those metrics, figure out like if we were asked to double this thing or we were asked to cut it in half, like what actions would we take? And then how can you really translate that into a day-to-day and week-to-week practice to get to those objectives? Because I love that point, Avi, which is if there's any one way to get all of this stuff completely wrong, it's to start from the bottom and just say we're going to improving change failure rate. Why? Doesn't matter. Right? We're just going to do it. And I think it's so crucial to be able to say here's the why, and then how do we get there based off of what goes into that outcome.
Yeah, totally.
I really, really love that. We covered so many great practical things, and I think to summarize, and then I'm going to pass the mic back to Avi in a second for one closing thought. So to summarize some of the key takeaways here, guys, which we'll certainly be writing about, and in collaboration with Avi, surely. There's so many great things for you to walk away from here. The first is to really think about how you can translate metrics and insights, not just into this like policing thing, but into celebrating the successes and to championing what's working. I think that's an underrated piece of the puzzle always. The other is that as a leader, you're always going to want to examine what are the trade-offs that are involved in these things. If you're pushing to optimize for something, or you're certainly looking to make some adjustment, understand like what are going to be the natural trade-offs here from a process and outcomes perspective, because we're all human. We can't maximize everything at once. That's not going to happen. So figure out what those trade-offs are, how you measure them, how you articulate them, and then get that buy-in and get that expectations managed as a team, as an organization, to figure out what's going to go into that. Because I think that's going to drive a culture that doesn't frustrate and burn people out. The other piece that I love that we landed on here is translating all of these metrics into action. Like, how can you go through this almost kind of pre-flight checklist when you're thinking of the things you're measuring and figure out if these were to double or they were to half or we were told we had to, even in this crazy theoretical, right? Maybe you're never going to do that, never going to see it, but it's going to stimulate those discussions as a team to figure out like, how do you translate these things into action? That's going to equip you with this more kind of practical list of things you can do to actually turn insight into action, which I'm so excited to keep riffing on. I think it's such a neat way and elegant way to think about it.
Mm.
And then I think lastly, to Avi's point, you always want to be thinking with the objectives in mind. Don't build this kind of bottom up strategy where you're kind of being reductive, to get to something nebulous by stitching together all these metrics. Like be deductive and start from that end and figure out, okay, if we're a detective and this is the press release we want to write, this is the outcome we want, like what would it take to get there and how would we assess if that's working? And let's build a process, let's build a dashboard, let's build a culture, let's build conversations that address that. To me, I love everything that you've shared here, Avi, because the outcome for me is even thinking about this all the time, I feel like I have a more clear playbook in my mind of like how do we turn these things into something meaningful. So I'm so delighted by this. And the final question I have, Avi, which is kind of like a feel free to give like a fortune cookie statement or a mini monologue, whatever you're comfortable with. But I would love if you could give us like your parting advice, like if there is one thing that you wish you knew when you got started as a developer, as an engineer, as an engineering leader, like what do you wish you knew when you got started, and what tips would you give to someone just looking to build better things?
Huh. I think I would what I would largely say one thing that I've been doing a lot more of as as Scarf has grown, and it's something that has really affected a lot of other aspects of my life is just the concept of like really ruthlessly prioritizing what you're doing, um, to really just figure out what matters and just do those things and be very proactive about those things and don't bother with the other things. I think there's both in open source and just in general, there's like always, kind of external pressure to please everybody, to do all of the, to do boil the ocean, do everything you could possibly do. Um, and the more time that goes on, the more I'm just an advocate of very, very narrowly focusing on the one thing that you need to do today or this week or whatever that looks like. Um, and over time, I feel like my job internally is just to be a broken record and tell people what the priority is this week or today or whatever, whatever length of time we're looking at. And so, in the open source space, I would say that's crucial, crucial, crucial because you're time is short and maintainers get burnt out, and I think that's often kind of often not being able to really focus on the things that matter, trying to do too many things. And so be protective of your time, be proactive with your time, and prioritize your time, and measure how that's going so you can do that better.
I think that's really well said, and I think it also neatly kind of ties up the entirety of our discussion, I think, which is ultimately what you're describing is like you're shifting from this like reactive state to a proactive state where you're, instead of saying like, okay, we've had these like 10 distracting things come in and we're going to deal with all of them, it's keeping that focus to say maybe, but here's like what's ultimately most crucial today and this week, and let's stay focused on that. And if there's anything I love evangelizing, because I never thought personally, right? I never thought I could get excited or inspired by metrics and data of all the sexy things in the world. It might be one of the least, but it is something that is very empowering at the end of the day. Is it does equip you to be proactive versus reactive. That's going to reduce burnout. It's going to help you stay focused, and it's going to translate into really better everything, I think. So I think that's really well said, and simple but effective and important guidance that is applicable to almost everything.
Mhm.
Marvelous. Well, I know, guys, that we're approaching the very end here, and went a little over time. And thank you, Avi, for going over time with us.
Of course.
Um, this was such a great discussion. I'm so grateful to have you as a friend, as a partner, as a collaborator.
Thanks so much for having me.
You guys will see in the Slack. We're planning to do plenty more with Avi and Scarf, and we'll be keeping you apprised of all of that. Do be sure to thank Avi. He's in the Slack, so feel most welcomed and encouraged to send him a DM to say thank you. Be sure to check
Or
out
just hi.
Scarf. And otherwise, we'll get back to everyone's mornings, evenings, afternoons, wherever you are. And as always, thank you for being part of the DevLake community.
So much, everybody.
Thanks, Avi. We'll see you soon, guys.